Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us and watching this Facebook Live on affordable housing. I am joined by our town administrator, Jim Gilday, and our town planner, Don Samet. And we just thought this would be a good time to give everybody a little bit of a history and a background on affordable housing, Westfield's obligations, and how we are planning on meeting them in a way that best meets the needs of our community. I get questions all the time, what would you like to see? And everybody says, no more apartments, no more apartments. And I thought, especially in light of the recent projects that have come forward, notably Westfield Crossing, and we can talk about Williams Nursery a little bit, to talk about what our obligation is, where we are, and why, no more apartments isn't particularly realistic in light of a court-ordered settlement that we have agreed to. And instead, we're working on how we can all work together to ensure that this obligation can work in the best interest of Westfield. So with that, I thought I'd start off with Don. I'm just going to play like Katie Couric, moderator here. These two are the ones with all the history and expertise. But I thought maybe we'd start off with Don to give a little background just on affordable housing in general and New Jersey's like Mount Laurel and everything else. And then I'm going to ask Jim to weigh in a bit on the history of Westfield's obligations. So Don, a little background for us would be great.
Little background. Well, there's the Fair Housing Act from 1985, and basically the Fair Housing Act was intertwined with a series of cases which are referred to as the Mount Laurel cases. And folks may have heard of Mount Laurel obligations, which is really synonymous with affordable obligations for municipalities. So the Mount Laurel line of cases, the Fair Housing Act from 85, they really stated that each municipality in the state of New Jersey has an obligation to provide for the realistic opportunity for the development of low and moderate income housing for its fair share of low and moderate income housing that's needed on a statewide basis. So what you're seeing is, and Jim will talk a bit about the history in Westfield, but over time, towns have put forward housing plans based on different rounds of affordable housing regulations that come out basically every 10 years. For example, right now we are in what's called the third round, which covers a time period between 2015 to 2025. It's strange to think that we're more than halfway through already. So each municipality has an obligation. You could attempt to shirk those obligations, but if you do, then you could run into some significant issues. Without a town putting forward its own housing plan, builders, developers can challenge a municipality by saying that you haven't met your affordable housing obligations. And then it's basically the courts that are deciding what gets built, how big it's going to be, where it's going to be built. And it takes the planning for where housing should be away from the hands of the municipality and puts it in the courts. Those are the so-called builder's remedy lawsuits, which you'll sometimes hear about. So, Westfield, I'm proud to say, has been very proactive in its affordable housing planning, and we've really been able to steer the ship. And we've really taken control of how we want to see our town develop, especially when it comes to meeting our affordable housing obligations, putting them in appropriate locations at appropriate densities. And it's something I think we've been very successful at. Without going too far afield, I'll state that we wound up initially with a very contentious relationship with the Fair Share Housing Center, who is really the agency now that's the prime advocate for low and moderate income households. We have our settlement agreement with them, and we've really become collaborators, I'll say, in meeting the affordable housing needs in Westfield in ways that we feel are most appropriate. So that's a bit of history, a bit of where we are today. But I hope it answers the question or gives some background for us.
That's great. And before I send it to Jim, just a couple questions. Like, what prompted the Mount Laurel decision in the first place?
Oh,
And
yeah.
because I've heard, it's really the result of the fact that New Jersey never did really what it was supposed to do. And hence that's why the courts got involved. And then can you also talk about, and that was, I know it's been going on for 30 years or more, how towns used to be able to pay to move their affordable housing obligations elsewhere, right? And so, and that process was eliminated, I don't know how long ago. So maybe you can give a little bit about that background, like why did we end up with these affordable housing settlements in the first place? And then I'm going to ask Jim to talk about our history.
It's been quite some time since I've read the Mount Laurel cases, but essentially what was happening was there was some exclusionary zoning. Mount Laurel was rezoning areas of the municipality in ways which there was no way it could be developed with affordable housing. For example, requiring larger sized lots, which resulted in larger sized homes, which were out of reach for low and moderate income families. Yes, and it wasn't called a payment in lieu, and the name always escapes me. Jim remembered, but it was
the RCA.
RCA, Regional Contribution Agreement. Municipalities used to, I guess you could describe it as being able to buy their way out of an affordable housing obligation. And that was through a regional contribution agreement with another municipality. The municipality that would be sending its obligation to another municipality, which was called a receiving municipality, will be able to essentially give money to, okay, we're not going to build the units, they're going to be built elsewhere, and we're going to pay another municipality to either create those units or run a rehabilitation program within their borders, and then that sending municipality no longer has that obligation to provide it within its borders. That provision was eliminated. I believe it was felt to be unfair, and that it was it wound up really in concentrating affordable units in more of the higher density urban areas of the state, rather than spreading the obligation,
equalizing it, right?
Equalizing it, yes. So they got rid of.
So Jim, did Westfield ever participate in that, and when? And then can you also talk about when Don mentioned we used to have a contentious relationship with Fair Share? Can you give a little bit of history on that and how that evolved into the collaborative relationship that exists today?
Sure. Thank you, Mayor. And again, hello, everybody. So as Don mentioned, the town, like everybody else, we had to comply with the previous rounds back in the 80s and 90s. And we did. And we usually did that through the courts. That was by choice of the town many years ago. And yes, Mayor, we did. Sometime in the 80s, I believe, there was the town did RCA agreements, regional contribution agreements with the city of Elizabeth. So there were obligations that the Westfield sent to Elizabeth. They were happy to get those funds to build affordable housing there. Just one back up for 1 second, because I think it's important when people, you hear affordable housing and what the obligation is. Just a little, sometimes people don't understand that some of the basic facts about when we say someone has to build affordable housing in our town, there's a percentage of a facility that they're building. So if they're building 100 units, for example, they have to set aside 15 or 20% of them for the affordable obligation. And unless, there's other ways you can do that, but it's just something that to consider. But, the only way that works financially for someone to come in and build something is you have to have market rate units, obviously, to offset that. So people hear affordable housing, there's not, unless it's otherwise negotiated, you're seeing a development go up of some number of units like we've had here in town, which we'll talk about in a second. And a portion of them are affordable housing. And we have a whole other set of rules and regulations and process that we have in place to make sure they're filled properly with an outside consultant that Don works with very well. But real quickly, just on the history, we comply with our affordable housing obligations in the 80s and 90s through the courts, which either meant we had, and what you do when you comply, the town must provide an opportunity for affordable housing projects to be developed in your town. That's through zoning, as Don mentioned. You change zoning regulations to allow that opportunity to happen. So the 80s and 90s, we did that. And just interesting fact, properties like Williams Nursery properties like town-owned properties over on Grandview and Myrtle Avenue, those were properties that were identified back in the 1991 or 92 plan, I think, that was, I guess, approved at sometime in 95 for affordable housing obligations to be fulfilled of those properties. Just gives you a sense of, those are properties that identified in the mid 90s that literally only today, Williams Nursery has come to us, obviously, with a proposal to finally fulfill those obligations. And of course, the Myrtle and Grandview properties, another very proud thing for the town. Those are town-owned properties. We held on to for years, and we were able to find a willing partner, not only to do affordable housing for the town to complete its obligations in that area, but it ended up being special needs housing, which we partnered with the Arc of Union County. And those 2 homes are now finished, I believe. I think one is done. I think the other one might be finalizing soon. And providing special needs housing right here in Westfield for special needs adults with jobs, and really nice projects. And the county did a nice thing there. So fast forward, 1990s, we complied. As Don mentioned, we are in the 3rd round of affordable housing, and Westfield had, not the greatest relationship with COA. And like many towns, you didn't really want to deal with COA, but we did. We had a consultant planner for years. And in 2005 or 2006, we decided we really needed an in-house full-time planner. At that time, we hired a woman by the name of Judy Thornton, who was our first full-time planner. And she was instrumental in getting the town council, particularly, to understand the benefits of being a COA town and being part of that. And as Don mentioned, controlling your own destiny, control the projects, be able to control the materials, the size. And so we began that process back in 2007-8. And at that point also, we had our first builder's remedy lawsuit that came through, which prompted us then to, of course, go back to the courts, as we had been a court town for many years. And as you mentioned, Mayor,
Jim, I'm sorry, just to clarify, because you mentioned a court town or a COA town.
Sure.
Just to clarify exactly what you mean by that.
So basically, towns have the ability to go to the Council on Affordable Housing, otherwise known as COA, and become a COA town, meaning you partner with the state organization, and you then create a relationship with them to then change your zoning to allow that to happen. In Westfield's case, we had never applied to COA before 2007 or 8. We'd always been a town that went to the courts to satisfy its obligation, or have agreements approved, such as the RCA agreement with Elizabeth many years ago, back in the 80s.
And I'm sorry, Jim, just to clarify, when you say go through the courts, is that done on a case-by-case project basis, or how did that interaction with the court happen?
Don, you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the court towns, there are 2 ways to do it. Like the COA town, as Jim is mentioning, is a municipality would file for something called substantive certification with COA. And it's basically Council on Affordable Housing, COA, reviews and endorses the town's affordable housing plan. An alternative way was you go straight to the court. It's almost like, and I've never been involved with that particular way, but it's basically the court is approving your housing plan rather than COA. Currently, all towns are court towns. Under this latest round, where it landed, essentially, the courts now have control of reviewing and approving housing plans, and that's what we've done in this latest round as well.
Got it. All right, sorry, Jim. I just wanted, because I think that's very important, and I think it's something that our town should be very grateful for, that we are a proud COA town, and it emanated from really initial builder's remedy lawsuit back in 2007, and in a perverse way, that builder's remedy lawsuit forced us, or really forced the conversation about us being a proactive COA town, which I think has now set us up to be in a much better position than we maybe otherwise would have been. Did I say that accurately?
No, I think you did. And that's the thing. It was our initial full-time planner that, a lot of this is education, understanding the benefits. And so the town council was finally, back in 2008 and 9, was convinced that we should be applying to COA. And of course, at that same time, the builder's remedy lawsuit came in. As Don mentioned, it's very correctly, now everyone's really a court town, because COA has been really non-existent for the time being at the state level. And but to go to your point, Mayor, so we the builder's remedy lawsuit, really put a very distinct focus on things. And, so now we flash forward, we go forward and we spent years negotiating with the courts to get a housing plan approved. Don and I these couple of days in a car with a court assigned master. So towns were assigned a master to come in and work. So Westfield's a little different than some other communities in the sense that we are considered what they call a vacant land town, which basically means we have no vacant land. We're fully developed, and there's very small areas where we have ability to do something new. And so we had to come up with creative ways to still comply with the regulations without having a lot of land. Other towns in South Jersey, for example, we have land in all sorts of places. I go travel with my son to soccer games. I wish we had the land we had to do fields and all sorts of different developments, but we don't. So we had a couple of creative ways to satisfy our obligations, and I know Don will talk about the obligations in a little bit, but also, make sure we're in control of our destiny of the size and how many units we're having in town. Because if we didn't do that, if we weren't proactive, we'd be subject to further builders remedy lawsuits saying, hey, you have an obligation of X and you can't, comply with it. Therefore, we're going to sue you, and the courts would likely, rule against us. We've seen that happen in some neighboring places, and it's not a very advantageous position to be in. So we took that, and you're right, Mayor. We are all the years, obviously, we comply, but now we're very proud COA town. And let me give Don a little credit here, more than he said himself. We are not only a proud COA town, but due to our Special Affordable Housing Council, Jonathan Drill, and Don Sammett's efforts, our town planner here, we are thought of as probably one of the top 5 towns in the state, I would say, that we are complying with our regulations, our requirements, and we are looked to by Fair Share Housing, who we now not just work with, we collaborate with. They're a partner of ours. And we're able to go back to them and get things done when we have created things on our own, which we'll talk about later as well, which can help the town and its development and planning efforts. That's something that doesn't happen very often, but that's a very good thing the town should be proud of today where we are.
So can you talk about that? Because I think what's news to people is the property that's been designated or allowed, enabled affordable housing. And I don't think people really pay attention, nor understandably, until suddenly a project appears and is presented to the planning board or their council, whatever it may be, like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. So you mentioned the master was literally driving around in a car with you and Don. And what were you just pointing out? Like, this could be a place. And how did you all arrive at where we netted out? And then can you talk about what properties ultimately were determined and why?
Well, I'll start, Don. I'll pass it to you. I guess if we weren't proactive, what ends up happening is, and this is kind of almost sounds silly, but it's true. If you're not being proactive with this court master, people go on the Google Earth and look for open space, right? And we, of course, Westfield has some space, so we didn't want that to happen. We wanted to take control of that. So the court master came in, and we drove around on multiple occasions. And Don had gone through and identified properties that either, it's a combination of things, properties where things could happen where there was nothing on the property, properties the town owned, properties that could be in the need of rehab, which is also a part of the program. And we drove around the properties, and by going there in person and seeing the property firsthand, what was happening there, that gave the master, gave us credibility of the master to say, look, we're not just trying to push this property off the list. We're telling you this is functioning in this way and it's helpful to the town, or vice versa. This could use to be rehab. This could use to be changed. And we want to see something happen here because it's been dilapidated and blighted for years. Hence the Westfield Crossing project, for example, where we have land that's, obviously been used for storage for years. And so anyway, those are things that actually make a difference. And so, but because we had so little vacant land and we had so many requests for areas to be looked at, everything from the Armory, for example, National Guard Armory, what's being used there today, what could it be changed? That's in our plan as well. But a good example is Williams Nursery. Again, here's a property that back in the 90s was decided that should be a good place, that if something was to happen, obviously it's got a lot of space there. The owners of the property, even today, they always knew that that would shut down at some point and become a new type of residential living. And here we are almost 20 years later. And now finally getting to a project of some sort. It can take as long as that. And one last thing to say before I pass it to Don, while we've complied with our first 2 rounds, and now we have an excellent compliance and a court settlement for round 3, and we're in that until 2025. The difference today versus the 2 prior rounds, the rules change every round. There's different rules to comply with, different things you can and cannot do. And of course, the developing market in the state of New Jersey, the developers has changed. So unlike the first 2 rounds of compliance, in this 3rd round, not only do we comply, we have a great relationship with affordable housing and fair share, but developers are now knocking on our door, literally on Don's door, regularly, coming to us saying, "Oh, I see you have this zoning that's here. I have an overlay zone. What can I do to see if that works for me? Can I?" So we're entertaining developers regularly, but the point, the main thing is we now have control. We have an approved plan. Fair Share Housing endorsed it. The town council endorsed it. We're approved by the court. And now we have control rather than trying to skirt our responsibilities and being subject to a Bills Remedy lawsuit, where then you lose control and all of a sudden you're faced with a 300 or 400 unit complex that you can't control. So, Don, you want to just tie into that, because I think it's
And let me ask a couple of follow-up questions to that, which Don could probably answer. And I think one other point is that credibility that we now have with Fair Share enables us to make adjustments a bit on the way, and we can talk about the adjustment that we're making on related to the Williams Nursery site. But a couple of questions about the process. So you drive around with the master, right? Can you talk about ultimately what properties were identified, just generally speaking? After they're identified, then what had to happen to enable them, and we can go from there, Don.
Okay, so I mean, why were we driving around in the first place? We were because we knew that the town did have an affordable housing obligation, which it needed to address, right? So the question becomes, what are appropriate locations within Westfield where we can provide the units that we're obligated to provide? The benefit, as Jim said, where do things start? It starts from various professionals taking a mile-high look, probably literally using Google Earth or Google Maps, but no real indication of what is happening on the ground, right? So the court master came in and they said, all right, we've got a list of sites. Show us around, show us what's happening on each of these sites. We'll see if they are appropriate locations for affordable housing. I can remember actually not only driving our court master around, but providing him maps, explaining what was going on in various sites. So in our tours with him, we looked at locations that were maybe in need of some rehabilitation. They had easy access to downtown and other commercial areas in town. They had access to mass transit, not only bus, but also rail. So the locations that were selected primarily are along the North and South Avenue corridor and in our downtown. So again, there are places where you would want to provide various means of transportation and ease of access to goods and services. Part of the work we did with the court master in identifying these locations was that we were able to keep our single family residential districts intact, right? Westfield is primarily detached single family housing. We were able to keep those areas zoned as they are. And we really focused on the North and South Avenue corridors and in the downtown area where multifamily and mixed use development is more appropriate than putting it out somewhere in the middle of a single family residential zone.
Okay, so let's talk numbers.
Okay.
And I just want to reiterate a comment that Jim had made earlier, because it's important that people understand, like, why so many, if it's how many affordable housing, but in order for it to be profitable for a developer, they have to be able to put in what we call market rate units, right?
Yeah.
And the affordable units are 15% if they're rentals of the total project. So if our obligation is to provide 6 affordable units, that actually requires a 40-unit apartment building to generate those 6. So I think that's what people need to understand. Like Westfield Crossing, we're generating 32 units, right, Don? 32 affordable units. I think that's right.
Yeah, I have it somewhere.
So, and that it's 15, and that's why that project might seem very large. It is our largest project, but it's 15, only 15% of them are affordable. So that's what happens, and that's mandated by the courts. In order to get the developers to even consider building this affordable, they have to give them the opportunity to make a profit. And that is why, even though our numbers might not be huge in terms of what the obligation is, it's only 15% of what needs to be built overall in order to meet that obligation. So that's just, I think, a really important point for people to understand.
Right.
So, so Don, and then just I want to talk about numbers so people understand our obligation. But after those areas are defined, and then you all in a group work together to identify what is the appropriate density on each of these various sites based upon its location, and what is reasonably to be considered, what can be managed without, traffic issues and so forth too much. Then there has to be this is the zoning overlays. And that's where, and talk about that process with the zoning overlays.
Sure.
And it's also important to mention, just because the zoning allows it to happen doesn't mean it will. So if you can talk, so just mention what that means, and then I want to talk about numbers.
Sure. Well, each municipality, I may have to dip into the numbers a bit here. Each municipality has an obligation that's comprised of 3 components. One is a prior round obligation from prior rounds of affordable housing requirements. Westfield has satisfied its prior round obligation. The second is a rehabilitation obligation, which is, as the name implies, rehabilitation of substandard units. Westfield has also satisfied that obligation through participation in the Union County Home Improvement Program. The third is what's called prospective need or unmet need, and that's where the obligation to provide additional units comes about. So Westfield has determined by our settlement and our court agreement an unmet need of 1,090 units. But that doesn't mean 1,090 affordable housing units are going to be built. We, as was alluded to before, as Jim said, we don't have vacant land here in Westfield. So we're able to get what's called a vacant land adjustment, showing that we don't have the opportunity to build or the ability to construct 1,090 affordable units. We have space for, we found 62 affordable units.
So Don, I'm sorry, just how did it even arrive at that crazy number? Is it just a formula that they plug in based upon certain variables that has no basis in reality?
Yeah, they're based upon projected growth in the region, and then it filters down to municipality. I'll use the term mile high again. It's mile high calculations. How the numbers were calculated were actually the subject of a lot of the litigation taking place surrounding the third round. And even with the latest round of numbers, there were consortiums of municipalities that were arguing the numbers that Fair Share Housing Center came up with, and there was a whole back and forth. But it's basically, this may sound negative, but it's a bunch of academics sitting around and doing the calculations. And I don't mean.
And it sounds like it's a bunch of lawyers making a lot of money on it too. But that's a conversation for another day. But so our crazy number of 1,090 actually gets down to 62. Right?
Well, it gets down to 62 that we can build. So the difference between 1,090 and 62 is what's called our unmet need. So we have to provide the opportunity to help to meet that unmet need. It doesn't mean they have to be built out. There's no way we're going to see 1,090 units, but we have to address that unmet need. And how we've done that is through the creation, in part, there were some zoning modifications to existing affordable housing zones. We have a development fee ordinance where certain new construction or rehabilitation requires payment into an affordable housing trust fund, which is used for various affordable housing programs in the town. We have a mandatory affordable housing set aside for any project that is as a result of a zone change or a redevelopment plan that includes residential units at a certain density and certain number.
So Don, just to be clear on that, so
Mhm.
that would be in an area where maybe hasn't been zoned specifically or overlay zone, and somebody comes and says, I want to build an apartment project here. They are obligated to set aside 15% of at least 15% of the units for affordable housing, right? Here, even though they're not in the zone,
Correct. That
in the
is,
current zone.
yep, it would have, and if it's a subject of a rezoning, a redevelopment plan, or a use variance granted, they'll have to provide it. See, again, it's addressing that unmet need. At present, we may not have an area that is, say, zoned for residential, but if we create a redevelopment plan, say you can do it, well, you're also required to put affordable housing within that development. And
So if we get to, let me just clarify this. So our 62 is what they said, this is what we know you're able to build today, right? And 62 units is really 400 apartments, because 62 is the set aside essentially, right? So they say you're capable of building that today. And then when we do that, that doesn't mean we're done. And I think that's the questions people ask me, when are you finished?
yeah,
When are you finished? And I think it's important to understand, we're not really, even when we met the unmet need, we're not really finished, and we're not even able to deny somebody. If we got to our 62 and someone came to proposal, we have an obligation to enable that project, right? As part of our continuing obligation.
yeah.
So the answer to the question is, we're not really ever really done.
No, we have that unmet need, and the overlay zones are part of meeting that unmet need. There isn't like we're done. I guess the we're done is every single piece of property that's identified for affordable housing is built out. The likelihood of that happening, probably not high at all, especially given that we're 6 years now into our affordable housing plan. We're not near seeing a build out of all those lots. I think it's important to note, I'm also talking about this 1,090 minus 62, but even with the remainder where we're required to address, the overlay zones don't come, the maximum build out, not of affordable units, but total units is something like 690, 700 units in total. So we're never going to see this, 1,090 or 1,028 number of affordable units built. And then on top of that, the market rate units, we're going to see much less.
Mayor, do you want to go
yeah,
through
go
the projects real quick that make up
Yeah.
that 52, but just so the public can see how that
Yeah.
comes about?
I think, and Jim, why don't you, between the two, what was the very first one we did?
The first one was probably 333 Central, right? That really was the first against the 62 number. So we had, Don, you have more information, but I know we had 333 Central in the corner of South and Central. We have the Parker, which is on the corner of Broadway and West Broad. We have the Ross Place development, which is in process of being built now. We have what I call the Pan Am, but is now known as the Bentley, which is the old Pan Am Cleaners in the traffic circle.
I'm hearing rumors they're changing their name now.
Oh, really? Okay.
Oh.
Yeah.
So we have that. And then the last one is the Westfield Crossing, which we just recently approved. And those were all, Don, if I had this right, those were all those projects are part of the settlement agreement in 2017 to go against that 62 number, which the 62 number is known as the realistic development potential, right? Or someone that may be from that need too, Don?
So they don't all count towards our realistic development potential. Some of them count towards unmet need.
Yeah, and so I'll talk about 333 Central a bit because I've gone on the record that that's a project that I've never been, and that's not just me. I've heard it from quite a few residents and constituents about. Um, uh, Actually, people I think generally weren't necessarily even taking issue with the use. I mean, it was a blighted piece of property. It had that old house on. I remember there was some light in the top of the house. Do you remember that? A little bit off. There's a road. I think what I think I certainly, it's my personal opinion, but I think others have agreed that it was a bit of a lost opportunity to create something that could have been really impactful and beautiful as a gateway to Westfield. And I think people feel it was a missed opportunity, and I do too. But the reality is, we're certainly what we're discovering, with Westfield Crossing, is that the margins on these properties for our developers is not really high. And especially when the obligation is to build the affordable housing, even though they have market rate units. So so as a result, you can get projects that don't provide the public benefits that we wish they did, that aren't built with the quality of the materials that we wish they were, and where we can't necessarily dictate even the configuration of the bedrooms, 1 and 2 and 3 bedroom units, other than what's the minimum that's mandated by affordable housing. So it was actually 333 Central, and we had never used redevelopment for any of our affordable housing projects. And so when my administration came in, many of these projects were already in the queue, either where they were done or they were far enough along in the process. It was Westfield Crossing, which is the Savelle's property that we're talking about, was the first one that really came in the queue. And I think we all agree that it is a gateway to Westfield from that east side of town, that it is in a blighted area that could benefit from a real significant quality project that attracted great investment. And we thought that if there was an opportunity to use redevelopment in order to get a better project and provide community benefit, we should do that. And that's certainly where we netted out with Westfield Crossing. I think we've been working on it for 2 years. It's been a pretty significant negotiation, and I do think it's going to be a project that benefits the community and the neighborhood. But I think it's not every project warrants a redevelopment agreement. I think it does based upon the specific nature and visibility of the site, what kind of public amenities we might want out of that. But in my mind, 333 Central is one that might have been had a greater community benefit if we had done that with the redevelopment.
And Mary, you want to, you maybe just to touch on the, Don, maybe give the makeup of what's required, the affordable housing obligations required for bedroom makeup whenever you have a unit or a proposal, because that's something people always ask me as well. Like, why so many 3 bedrooms? Why 2 beds? There are obligations for the affordable housing units, no matter what the developer wants to do.
That's right.
Yeah.
The rules, they're called the Uniform Housing Affordability Controls, and they dictate maximum and minimum percentages for efficiency in 1-bedroom units, 2-bedroom units, and 3-bedroom units. So, I mean, it boils down to you have to have a mix of those unit sizes, and really it's to prevent a builder from just putting in all studio affordable units, right? The intent of the legislation is that you're providing affordable housing for different size households. So you have a maximum percentage of efficiency in 1-bedrooms, minimums for 2 bedrooms and 3-bedroom units in any affordable development. And it's only for the affordable units, not the market rate units.
Right. And Don, and there's 2 things I want to mention about that. One is, we talk about affordable housing in the context of Westfield. I really think it's more workforce housing.
Right.
And the income thresholds, there's very low, there's low, and there's moderate. And I was just looking up, and this is, I think, 2 years old, that in Westfield, a family of 4, a low income is considered $45,000, moderate is considered $72,000, So we're talking about what I like to call workforce housing.
Right.
It could be teachers, it could be public, could be firemen, it could be social workers, the type, honestly, the folks that you want living in your community that no longer really can afford to be here because of really the elimination of what has eliminated our starter stock, if you will. And right. And the other thing that I want to mention that was one of the benefits, I think, of the pilot agreement we're doing at Westfield Crossing, to your point, we can't, after beyond the affordable housing obligation, if they need to make money by putting in more 2- and 3-bedroom units without a redevelopment agreement, and in a pilot in particular, we do not have the tools to force them to change that mechanism that we worry about could, have maybe a greater influence on schools. Westfield Crossing in particular, as an example, they had initially came to us with a proposal with a significant number of 3 bedrooms. And because of using, which I know people, we could talk about schools in a second, but people's concerns about school crowding and so forth, we were able to mandate that they only provide the minimum number of 3-bedroom units required by Fair Share. So there is a benefit to these redevelopment agreements and pilots where you can have a little bit of latitude to be able to force things that could ultimately be better for the community. So Don, talk about schools, because there's 2 things that we hear about apartments: schools and traffic, right? So let's talk about schools first. So what is your experience on the impact of these new affordable housing projects on schools?
Well, we look at the projects because they're a mix of affordable units and market rate units. And there have been studies done by Rutgers University. I remember reading one that came out of the Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. And, I think the perception is you build a multifamily development and there are all these school age students coming out of it. But the data is showing differently. Right. And Mary, you had actually done a survey of some of our local developments here as to what's coming out of those, what school age children are coming out of those developments. And it's really small. I remember there was the South Orange Village president, Gina Collum. She talked about a project in her town where there's a 33-unit project and they had 1 school age child coming from it. And our numbers here are similar. The numbers seem to come, and perhaps not unexpectedly, from construction of detached single-family homes. You get the 3, 4-bedroom homes, even more here in Westfield, and they're being populated with growing families. So that's where, on a unit-by-unit basis, that's where you're seeing your school children impacts. You certainly will get some school-age children in multifamily developments, but they're not comparative really to what happens with detached single family housing. So, I think the perception is certainly worse than the reality. And there have been studies to show that.
Yeah, and I agree. And that point is, in Westfield, of the 120 units that we built to date that Jim mentioned, they came with 5 school age children, which I know is less than half of, I think, what even the Rutgers study would project. And I think that, I think I will tell you, it does seem odd to me that it's like, okay, if you come and you build a new house, rip down new and build it, we're okay if you have kids. But if you rent in Westfield, we're not okay if you have kids. And it just seems a little, I don't know, it doesn't feel very equal. And so I do think that this narrative about apartments bringing lots of kids has not proving to be accurate. I also think what you're finding is that the rents on these places, the market rates, are pretty expensive. And you could argue whether that's good or bad, but it is what it is. So if you're going to spend $2,500 to $3,500 a month on rent, many of those people would prefer to own a single family home with their kids. And that's certainly, I think, what the data is showing.
And I could tell you just anecdotally from people who have called my office, we have, who am I hearing from? People that would want to stay in town, but not necessarily own the single family home. Folks who the families have split by divorce, and one of the parents would like to stay in town, but will no longer be living in the detached home. And basically folks who want a downtown living environment, but they're empty nesters, they're people that are newly in the workforce. My office isn't getting calls from families that are interested in these affordable units or the market rate units as well.
Okay, so we call them newly single, I think is the
Newly
term
single is the
for
term, okay.
newly single. Exactly. Jim, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I think just to tie on what Don said, maybe Don, you just give a little information. It might be a good time to talk about our third-party administrative agent, Community Grants Planning and Housing. It's important for two reasons. One, there is a very legal process to qualify for these units,
right?
And we have outside help for that. And Don can talk a little bit about that. It's on our website too. We can give more information on that as well. And one other thing before Don talks about that is that just if anyone's wondering about how all this stuff being paid for, so for example, as Don mentioned before, we have a affordable housing trust fund. That trust fund was established, I think 2013 or 14. What that is a triangular agreement between a local bank and Fair Share or the state Fair Share Housing and the town, approving the fact that we're collecting developers' fees to be used for monies so that the town taxpayers don't necessarily have to bear the burden of either creating affordable housing, paying for services to manage affordable housing. So, for example, the local our special affordable housing council is paid for out of the affordable housing fund. Any work he does, the Community Grants Planning and Housing third-party administrative agents paid for out of that. Don is named as our housing liaison. His money that he gets paid for that work, which seems to be a lot more these days than before, is also paid out of that. So the public should be very, thankful that a lot of the costs, and this was set up years ago to make sure that taxpayers didn't have to actually bear the burden for that. And that money can also be used for rehabbing units, preparing, encouraging other units to be built without having to hit the taxpayer as well. So maybe Don, you talk about the Community Grants Planning and Housing. That's a good thing. Maybe some of the public might have questions about how do I qualify? How
that, I think, I think people want to know how and what is the process for actually getting into an affordable unit. So that would be a good thing to talk about.
Sure.
And then we have to talk about traffic because that's the other thing. So,
sure. So we do contract with Community Grants Planning and Housing. They're responsible for administering all the applications for affordable units for those units which are in town. They also handle a number of other municipalities throughout the state. And really the process to apply for and get in the queue for these affordable units, and there is a very large demand for the units in Westfield, but you can either call them or go online. The website is www.affordableHomesNewJersey.com. And you can fill out a pre-application right on the website, put in your information, indicate what units you're interested in, whether they're Westfield or even in another municipality. I don't want to really advertise for other municipalities, but you can do that. If you don't have access to the web, or you'd like to share a phone number with somebody, it's area code 609-664-2769, extension 5. And they not only administer the applications, they'll coordinate between the landlord and the tenant. They also administer an affordability assistance program for us, which provides 3 months rental assistance to tenants of units. And that program is funded by our Affordable Housing Trust Fund as well. So I encourage anyone who knows of someone that's looking or is looking themselves to go to that website, call that number, and fill out a pre-application.
And there's one other thing, Mayor. I think it's important to note that people always ask me, I know they ask you as well, when are we going to have the market saturated? Is there enough, how can we populate all these apartments? And just to give the public a sense, when we first had our first lottery through the Community Grants Planning and Housing, which is a requirement for the process initially, I think it was thousands of applications, thousands for 6 units. Just to give you the demand that there is for affordable units. So the affordable units are usually the first ones to be filled in every new complex right away. But the demand is very high statewide, not just in Westfield. Westfield obviously is one of the more desirable places, but again, statewide demand is very high. So the affordable units fill up very quickly through the process.
Yeah.
And just to add on to that, Jim, because the other question is, well, why are we building more apartments when, you know, we still have vacancies in the current ones? Well, the reality is these builders would not be building these apartments if they weren't confident in the occupancy rate to make it worth their while. And so while you might have a perception that there's a high vacancy rate, there is turnover in many of these, and it's sufficient enough to make it, you know, Westfield a desirable place to continue these projects. So I don't think that's, you know, what the perception versus what you might think is happening isn't the reality of the projects that we're getting.
Right.
And I'm sorry, Don, I interrupted you.
Oh, I was just gonna say, you know, all of the numbers that, number of people that apply for these units is high. There's a preference given to the Westfield housing region. We're in what's called Region 2. So, I mean, it's Essex, Morris, Union, and Warren counties, right? 4 big counties, but not the entire state. Another common misunderstanding is that Westfield residents get priority. Unfortunately, they do not. Only folks in the housing region will get a priority. So we can't earmark units for Westfield residents. That would be against the state laws.
Okay, so traffic. When you all worked with Fair Share to identify the locations and the density of these things, how was traffic flow and circulation taken into consideration to identify those projects?
Yep.
And what do we do? And just talk about what we're doing about it now to make sure that we mitigate, you know, these kind of inconveniences to residents.
Yeah, it goes back in part to when I was speaking, and Jim and I were both speaking about going around town with our court-appointed housing master. You know, we looked at areas where there was access to transit, where there was the ability to walk to goods and services. So we want locations where there would be less reliance on the automobile, right? So hopefully that will shave off some of the vehicular trips that may normally occur from a development out in the hinterland somewhere, or even from the core of some of our single family areas. So it was the ability or the ease to use transit if you so choose, to walk and even to cycle. For now, what we're doing now, as part of our update to our master plan, we had a traffic consultant come in, and they looked at a build out of primarily the downtown area, but took into account the Westfield Crossing project. And they've made some recommendations for traffic signal improvements, timing improvements on them. And they've also recommended to us some additional studies or working with the county and or the state for the intersections at North Avenue and East Broad and the traffic circle. You know, we recognize that more units could bring more vehicles, and especially when we look at what's happening in neighboring municipalities, including Garwood. So we have to take a careful look at that. So it's going to be a combination, I think, of some traffic signal improvements, possibly some roadway improvements, and working with the county and state, and really promoting alternative modes of transportation, using transit when possible, walking when possible, getting on the bike when possible. And you look at the efforts such as, you know, the Green Team and what they've done, and the new, forgive me, Mayor, it's the bicycle committee involved with that. So and also the bike peds plan we've done. So we're trying to, as much as possible, get people out of their vehicles and don't use them when they don't have to, but also taking a careful look at what our existing infrastructure is able to accommodate.
And we recognize that I think there's 4 intersections that seem to be hot issues that we are aware of. And I honestly, irrespective of even any new development, it is South Avenue traffic circle. It's that intersection of Central and South.
Yeah.
It's that intersection coming out of the North Avenue train station
Mhm.
across, and it's the intersection by Bavella's at, those seem to be the immediate hot button spots that we're aware of.
Right.
And we would like to think like bike, multimodal and bike lanes and all those are part of a larger vision. But certainly, I think that's one of the things. I was just going to look at some of the questions that came in to see if we've covered them. One was about traffic. And one is about, I think it's more about how if someone, oh, I see. If someone goes into, and this might be a question for, maybe we can tell them how to go. If someone qualifies for affordable housing, and then they get in and their income rises so that they would no longer qualify as someone who is applying for the first time, can they stay as an affordable housing and pay that affordable housing rent, or do they move into a market rate and open up a spot for somebody else?
Now,
You
they,
know that?
I do. I checked with our administrative agent. They actually can stay in the unit. There's nothing in the state law that requires any kind of annual certification for income. Sort of the this policy or law is that they can now save money to move on to something else, something better for them, if you will, and that then will free up the unit. But when the unit does become free again, it has to be marketed for as an affordable housing.
Another question that came in: why isn't the Williams Nursery site being added to the adjacent Lenape Park? Is there a project coming up on North Avenue since several businesses are leaving? Do we require truly independent impact studies on road, schools, and other costs? So do you want to tackle those, Don or Jim?
Well, Williams site, as Jim mentioned, has been part of our housing obligation since the early 90s. As a private nursery, I believe we have to include it in our realistic development potential number, a site where affordable housing could be built. It would take, obviously, someone to finance the purchase of that property, whether it's the municipality or the county, to then make it a public land and make it part of Lenape Park. So absent that, you're competing against the private market for a purchase of the property.
Yeah, just on that too, there's the Lenape Park is a county park.
Yeah.
And so there's never been any interest, as far as we know, about that. But Don's right. Either the county or the town would have to buy the property, and it's an enormous property, as everyone probably knows. And I'm not sure there's any interest in the county on annexing that to their property at this point.
And then Don, what kind of impact studies do we do for roads, schools, and so forth? And who would pay for that?
Well, really for traffic, it's part of, I mentioned the master plan work that we're doing. So it's accommodated in that on a broad scale. But as part of these major projects, they go in for a site plan review with the planning board. So the planning board would look at access and egress to and from the site. They would look at internal circulation, any necessary infrastructure that needs to be put in would be as part of site plan approval. A good example of that is 333 Central. There were some intersection improvements there, putting in a dedicated right turn lane, namely. School-age children studies are typically not part of a site plan application. But I know that, the town is in constant contact with Board of Education regarding potential for school impacts.
And thank you for bringing that up, Don, because we do host, and certainly we're doing it in person, regular meetings with the school superintendent and Dana Sullivan, the administrator, and typically the president and vice president of the Board of Ed. We're going to be going back to that, and we kind of lay out the roadmap for what development is happening. We talk about their school age projections. The student population has been declining for the last 6 years. I think they're projecting next year to be back where they were in 2015, I believe. So, there is no concern at this point about projected impact on on schools for all the reasons that we mentioned before. And one other question, I'll just bring it up again. Someone asked about the housing, the income required for housing. And Don, in our, when a project is completed, does Fair Share dictate? I know there's very low, there's low, and there's moderate. Does each project have to include some of each, or not necessarily?
Yes, no, they do. No
Okay.
more than 50% of the affordable units can be for moderate income.
Got it.
And then the other 50% is a mix of the low and very low income. The very low income requirement is, I think, 13 or 15% of the affordable units need to be for very low.
Got it. So I think from what I understand, the majority of the apartments are being occupied by 2 members, give or take. And just for the point of reference, and this, I think this data is 2 years old, but a very low income is identified as about $22,000 a year. Low is about $36,000 a year, and moderate is $58,000 a year. So as I said earlier, if 50% of the units are required for moderate income, that is your, your social worker, entry-level public school teacher, et cetera. So, and obviously it would be great if we could keep them in the community. So let me ask Kim, are there any questions, Kim, that have come up?
I think you covered most of them, Mayor. There's 2 others that are that we can speak to. One is about the obligation that Westfield has. Is there a public document anywhere that residents can access that speaks to and breaks down those obligations?
Yeah, it's our housing element and fair share plan, our 2018 housing element and fair share plan. And Kim, it is up on the website.
I'll drop the link in the comments.
Okay.
And actually, yeah, that's an important point, is in that plan, if I'm not mistaken, Don, there is specific details on the RDP, the unmet need numbers, and
Yes.
specific, how we met the 62, or how we're going to meet the 62, and et cetera. So it's all right there in the plan.
That's right.
And we also did a kind of a FAQ document back in 2018, which is still relevant. So that's also on the town website as well.
And then, Mayor, we had a question asking, can we address benefits to downtown businesses who suffer from lack of weekday foot traffic?
Yeah, actually, I'm pretty excited, quite honestly, for the Bentley, which maybe might go by another name, to be opened. I think Lions Roar Brewery is very excited for that to open. And I will say, I've said this previously, I think I wasn't part of the settlement that these guys had reached previously, but I think generally did a really good job of putting these, identifying these sites across on the railroad tracks and close to our downtown. And as I keep saying, our downtown, to really revitalize it, we need to revitalize the ecosystem that supports the businesses there. And that means we need people living and working in our downtown to create ongoing organic foot traffic. So I think the benefit of, I'll just a little anecdote. I have a friend that actually rents office space downtown, and he said he lives in Scotch Plains. He said he never ever shopped in downtown Westfield. Since he works here, he doesn't shop anywhere else. And I think he's just a small little anecdote, but I think, if you can walk to a place and buy your, whatever it may be, you will. And that ultimately is what's going to attract new businesses. So I think that those are going to be great, and particularly for the South Side.
And
anything else, Kim?
Yep, one more that came in regarding seniors. Are any of these projects going to have housing for 55 and over adults, including affordable housing?
We have, in terms of affordable requirements, or the requirement to build affordable units, the town has actually maxed out the number of units that it can claim for affordable housing credit for seniors. So that does not prevent someone from coming in and building age-restricted housing where it's zoned for it. That can always happen, but you're not going to see it created as a result of any affordable housing obligation.
Yeah, I think, Don, we actually exceeded our
We did, yeah.
our numbers. So that's unusual for a community where
Yep.
Our affordable housing requirements for seniors have been well exceeded in the last
Right.
round. So again, there's always a need for more as we hear
Yeah.
the question, but nothing is precluding someone to come and propose that to us. But we wouldn't get any credit for that piece of it now because we've already exceeded that particular section of it.
That was by special court order decision from years ago.
And last comment, Don, about what's next. So the next round is 2025.
25.
And talk, what happens? Like, do they, like, what are they looking at, and what do they determine?
Well, we don't know, right? So we don't know if the state legislature is going to change the rules. What of the existing rules is going to stay in place? What's going to change? Is the Council on Affordable Housing going to be reinvigorated, and they'll be taking a bigger role than they were able to in this latest round? And will it be therefore taken off of the court's hands? So we're not quite sure. We don't know what the fourth round rules may be. I'm sure some of the folks that are, doing the deep dives into all this might have an idea, but I haven't heard anything yet. But we're constantly monitoring to see what's going to happen.
But the good news, I'll say, Mayor, is that when we get to that point in 2025, as Don mentioned, he's absolutely right. The second round was in litigation for years over the growth share litigation. So it could be years before it comes to a fruition. But the good news for Westfield, we'll be able to say that we have met our realistic development potential, RDP, that we have started to chip away at our unmet need. And we have, obviously provided opportunities through zoning, overlay zones particularly, and also met our rehab requirements, et cetera. So we'll have a lot of good things to report at that time, even more so than today. The question is, what are the new rules going to be, or whether the rules will be the same or not? But we have a lot of good things to report between now and then, I'm sure.
Well, we can end on that note, because I wanted the community to know that they should be very proud of, I think, your efforts and our reputation and relationship with the Fair Share. I think, we have done a really terrific job, and so much. There's some council action that's happening, I think, tonight, at the planning board, and then next week, we have, we're relocating some of our affordable housing obligation 6 units over to the Williams Nursery site. And they're being relocated from the Handler building on North Avenue, which is adjacent to Westfield Lumber, if anyone knows it, for 2 reasons. One is there's an interested contract purchaser who actually wants to rehab the building and keep it and turn it into something really interesting that's going to benefit the community. And so, that's always something that we want to do, and it's going to be a good economic development driver. But as it was zoned for affordable housing, meaning that nothing else could have been there either if it wasn't what it was, the only thing that could be there was a minimum 40 apartment unit, or maximum 40 apartment building with 6 affordable units. So by relocating the 6 affordable units to the Williams Nursery site, it mitigates the incremental impact on any incremental density on the Williams Nursery site. It now takes away a 40-unit potential building on what we call the Handler site, and any potential concerns that people might have about traffic. And now we could potentially get something that going to have a big community benefit. But we are only able to make those transfers because of our relationship and reputation with Fair Share Housing, and because of how we've lived up to our obligations thus far. So I would want the community to know that there are benefits for having done that, and our ability to be a bit flexible and adapt to opportunities that might present themselves that you couldn't have foreseen when we initially created that settlement.
Yeah.
So on that note, thank you so much. I know it's kind of complicated. I hope this was helpful to all of you. It's not easy, and there's never a very quick solution, but I just do want to give my hats off to Jim and to Don for all the work that they've done to get to this point. And just know that we're doing our best to live up to our obligations while making sure that we're maximizing the benefits to the community and mitigating whatever concerns you may have about this court-ordered obligation that we're fulfilling. So on that note, thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your very hot afternoon.
Thank you,
See you,
Mayor.
everybody.
Thanks, Don.